Giving Tuesday is all about celebrating generosity. And we're here to tell you that you have a chance to give back to a local nonprofit that means something to you. Boise State Public Radio is giving away $1,000 in on-air messaging to 2 randomly selected organizations that are nominated by you, our podcast listeners. Let's work together to uplift and give back to other nonprofits in Idaho by visiting us online at boisestatepublicradio.org to nominate your favorite nonprofit.
More Idaho Matters now from the studios of Boise State Public Radio News. I'm Gemma Gaudet. The Idaho state tree is the western white pine. This huge conifer is found in the western U.S. and Canada. However, this iconic tree is under threat from everything from logging to bark beetles to white pine blister rust. The lead producer at Outdoor Idaho, Lauren Malink, took a deep dive into this tree with her documentary, Return of the Giants, that airs this Sunday night at Idaho Public Television. And Lauren is joining us now to talk more. Hi, Lauren.
Hi, how are you?
I'm good, thanks. So, Lauren, tell us what the western white pine is. Can you what it is? Can you describe it for us?
Yeah, so the western white pine is a 5-needle pine. It grows up to 200 feet tall. Gets at its biggest, it can get up to 60 to 70 feet. The trunk. It's a massive tree. There used to be 60% of North Idaho forests used to be covered in western white pine, and now there's less than 10%. And it was a huge economic driver for Idaho in the early 1900s. And it's slowly started to disappear for a whole host of reasons. And so this program really digs into that history and looks at the trees from the scientific perspective as well as a historic perspective.
So you mentioned, they were used to be covered so much of Idaho's forest. Where is the tree found now?
It's still in North Idaho, but it's hard to find big ones. They have places where they still plant them, but the groves of giant white pines are not really there. And part of this program, we went hunting for the biggest remaining white pine in Idaho. So we found one up north by Nordman, which is north of Priest River. So there's still a few of them standing, but it's really tough to find this tree that used to just cover a large chunk of our state.
Mm-hmm. Can we talk about how those numbers have dropped? What do we know as to why?
Yeah, there's a bunch of reasons, one of which, and one of the bigger reasons, is a disease called blister rust. And that's a fungal disease that passes between a plant and the tree. And it essentially, after it goes through the needle and then the branch and then the trunk, and then it kills the tree. And that disease came over from Europe and Asia, and it just kind of decimated the population. And once they realized that it was killing these trees in the 40s, they decided to do a salvage harvest. So they cut down loads and loads of white pine trees, and that sort of switched the tree cover to a different species. And so we don't have the historic white pine stands that we once had. We have a different species, and that's changed the North Idaho ecosystem.
Mm-hmm. So what about bark beetle? What is that, and how much of a threat is it to the white pine?
Yeah, bark beetle is this tiny, tiny little beetle that gets and burrows beneath the bark and then eats the sugary layer between the tree and the bark. And it's naturally occurring. And so the scientists that we interviewed, they say that, a normal amount of bark beetle is okay, but once you have too many, they start mass attacking trees. And there are ways that scientists have figured out to put kind of scents on trees so bark beetles won't attack those trees. But that's just another issue that trees are facing. And that's one thing we learned throughout working on the show is that if it's not one thing, it's another.
Yeah. Well, what about logging? Has that played into how the white pine has been impacted?
Yeah, logging definitely has. And Idaho has such a history of logging. And this show, we definitely took a look at logging towards the end of the program. And it like I said, in the 40s, there was this salvage harvest that kind of decimated the population of white pine trees. But now they're trying to get white pine back on the landscape because the people that I spoke with are really believe that this is a tree that people want to have, and it's a great wood. The way it grows, there's not a lot of, the knots are all uneven spacing grids, which you'll see if you see video of the show. And so it's a really, really good wood to have. So this show kind of looks at this crux point between conservation and capitalism, where people who study trees are working hand in hand with people who cut down trees, and trying to figure out the best way to make a sustainable forest so that we continue to have wood, which we use and we're not going to stop using, but the North Idaho forests are healthy.
Well, how has wildfire played into this?
Yeah, that's so one of the issues with blister rust is that it makes forests more susceptible to wildfire. And so white pine is an interesting tree because what we learned is that it is more resilient to climate change. So some of these trees were able to withstand some of the massive fires, but as forests have kind of switched the main tree that is the cover, there's trees now that are not as resilient against climate change. And there's areas where the forests are dying from another disease, which is root disease. And those areas are really susceptible to wildfire because there's a lot of dead downfall and fuels that can help a fire just rage through an area. So white pine is always going to be, fire is always a risk, but removing white pine from the ecosystem has made fires, hasn't made them any better.
So even though there is so many, so fewer trees, these white pines than there used to be, how important, Lauren, is the white pine, though, to Idaho's ecosystem?
Yeah, it's really important. We interviewed a scientist who talked about there being a sense of place when you go into a forest and you understand the history and having this feeling of walking through a large grove of trees and understanding that this is what was here, this is what's been here for 300, 400 for immemorial. And so, and it's a really valuable species to the ecosystem because it allows, people we spoke with talk about the white pine allows for light to filter down to the forest floor. So animals can forage for food, and so flora can actually thrive in that setting. And so, it's incredibly valuable. And that's what we learned working on this show is people love this tree, and not just because they're pretty and tall, but because they bring a lot to the landscape and they're important to have. And then they also, they tie in directly to Idaho's history of logging and people living off the landscape.
So talk to us about some of the folks who are trying to help the white pine. I mean, because there are groups working together to save it, correct?
Yeah. There's a handful of group, a lot of scientists. In the show, we talk to some scientists who are doing experiments on spore trapping. So they've got some instruments up in North Idaho that are kind of like spinning devices with Vaseline smeared on slides, and they pick up blister rust spores, and then they take those back to the lab and analyze the DNA and find out how many spores are in a given area. So there's people that are doing that so they can work with timber companies and say, like, this is a good place to plant your trees, or this is not a great place to plant white pine, so that there can be a more concerted effort to bring white pine back, because some people may not want to plant white pine because they're afraid of blister rust. So that if they can have good information that says this will work for you, then they can be successful in returning to the landscape and making it a harvestable wood again.
So we talked about quite a few threats to the white pine. So Lauren, do you think the white pine can actually be saved and thrive in Idaho again?
I think that there's a lot of people that have a lot of positive feelings about it, and there's a lot of people that think that this is a tree that could be equated to the redwoods or the giant sequoias of Idaho. And if we can remind people of that and continue to remind people of that it can return. And I think there's a lot of hope in this, that there are trees that are naturally resilient to blister rust. And so that was part of former experiments, is tracking down 4,000 trees. They called the elite trees, and using those cones to grow blister rust resistant seedlings. So there is a lot of work being done because there's recognition that bringing this tree back to the North Idaho ecosystem would be huge in returning North Idaho to what it once looked like.
Well, I want to thank you so much for taking time to talk with us about this. We've been speaking with Lauren Malink. She is the lead producer at Outdoor Idaho, talking about her latest documentary. It's called Return of the Giants. It airs this Sunday night at Idaho Public Television.